The country's airline industry is facing yet another blow. Canada Jetlines announced it is grounding all flights and temporarily halting operations. The airline says it has been unable to find enough financing to keep flights in the air, and it plans to file for creditor protection. The move follows a mass resignation of 4 executives on Monday, including the company's CEO. Canada Jetlines first launched in September of 2022. This is the latest Canadian carrier to shut down following closures of Lynx Air and Swoop within the last year. We're now joined by Michael Osborne. He's the chair of Canadian competition practice at Cozen O'Connor, and he joins us today from Oakville, Ontario. Thank you so much for making time for us tonight.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Tell me, are you surprised by any of this?
No, I'm not. Failures of startup airlines, particularly in the low-cost segment, are pretty common. The unfortunate fact is that most of these airlines do not survive infancy.
I want to ask you, that we know that the demand for flying is there. This summer in particular, the number of flights are right where they were before the pandemic in many parts of the country, exceeding where they were, in fact, in the summer of 2019. And when you go to places like Europe or like the US and you look through flights, there's so many of these discount airlines, whether it's Flair in the US, Ryanair in Europe, many others. Why don't they seem to thrive in Canada?
Canada's a tough market for low-cost carriers. There are a lot of factors that feed that. One of them is that our airports are quite expensive. Landing fees at Pearson, for example, are quite high. That's partly to do with the model by which the federal government uses to get as much money as it can out of airports. Another factor is our geography and low population density is quite different from both Europe and the United States. Both Europe and the United States have lots of secondary airports. They have lots of markets that can support the visiting friends and relatives and leisure travel that low-cost carriers thrive on. And they have secondary airports that airlines, the low-cost carriers, can fly into instead of flying into the higher cost main airports. We just don't have that in Canada. By and large, we have one airport for every major metropolitan center, sometimes two, but generally one. The major metropolitan centers are a long way from each other, and compared to the US and Europe, they're relatively small. So when you add all that together, it makes for a very tough market.
Arguably, there's not much we can do about that, certainly not about the geography of Canada and some of the population patterns. But let's talk about some of the other factors. WestJet and Air Canada are two of the most dominant airlines on the market and have been for a while. Are they playing a part in this? Are they pricing out new competition?
So I don't know that. That would require a fair amount of study. Certainly there are techniques that carriers have used in the past. I can't say whether or not WestJet and Air Canada are doing this, but there are techniques that carriers have used in the past. For example, in the early 2000s, the Commissioner of Competition, in a case against Air Canada, alleged that Air Canada increased capacity and lowered prices in Eastern Canada to thwart WestJet's entry. Now, the case never went all the way to a judgment, so there's no decision on that point. And WestJet ultimately succeeded in transforming itself from a relatively small Western-based low-cost carrier to a full-service national carrier that it is today. So, there are things airlines, incumbent airlines, can and have done in the past. Whether they're doing that or not would require a pretty detailed study.
What do you think can be done to help low-cost carriers stay afloat? I'm thinking of some in Europe in particular that really thrive on what you just described. People who are not taking a trip of a lifetime, but who are maybe young people who just want to go to another city, maybe visit some friends and relatives. They're flying on a budget. Is there anything that can help support an airline that would befit this kind of a market and this kind of a customer?
Right. So if I had the magic formula, I'd probably start an airline myself, but I don't. As I say, these are tough businesses. One thing that we can do is to try to reduce the barriers to entry, including high costs associated with, for example, using airports. But it is going to remain a very tough business to enter in this country. Successful entry is relatively rare, although we've seen two, WestJet and Porter in the last couple of decades. Albeit that we've seen a whole bunch of failures in the low cost segment. There's no magic formula. This is a tough business. You enter small. You try to build a market, you pick the right routes. Unfortunately, carriers this year are facing some strong headwinds. There's a pilot shortage leading to increased pilot salaries. There's an aircraft shortage. There are a whole bunch of problems in the industry that are structural right now that make it harder for a new entrant.
Michael, thank you so much for that analysis. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Michael Osborne, Chair of Canadian Competition Practice at Cozen O'Connor, and he joined us today from Oakville, Ontario.